Hi, I'm Richard England, Vicar of Crofton Parish. Welcome to the second week of Alpha at Home. I hope you found the first week of our Alpha at Home course interesting and engaging, where we looked at the question, is there more to life than this? If you haven't had a chance to watch that session yet, I suggest you pause this video, you go back and watch that one first, because they kind of follow in a sequence really. That first video will help you a lot with what we're going to be thinking about today. If you weren't already aware, Alpha is one of the best introductions to Christianity that there is. It's been watched all around, attended all around the world. Nearly 30 million people have done Alpha. And this is our kind of shortened version of Alpha, a really great way to have an introduction to the ideas and to the person at the heart of the Christian faith while we're in this very strange period of quarantine and lockdown. Thank you so much for the comments and the feedback that we've had from the first Alpha session that we put online last week. You've commented, and you can comment again this week either through the Facebook page, or you can email alpha@croftonparish.org.uk. Thank you so much to everyone who put some comments in through the Alpha email address. Normally on Alpha, we would have group time straight after the presentation, and there'd be a chance to talk through your comments and your questions then. But the way we're doing it this time is that if you put comments and questions in through the email or on Facebook, I'll try and make some time the following week to respond to the things that you have said. We've got a few questions that people have put in via email. Let me try and answer them, or let me try and kind of offer some thoughts to them as best I can. I'm going to stick to questions that are particularly related to what we looked at last week on the is there more to life than this question. So here we go. This is the first question. If stuff can't just appear and has to be made, where did God come from? That is a great question. Last week we looked at why is there something rather than nothing, and we looked at the idea that everything within the physical universe exists within the principle of cause and effect, and the idea that you can take that chain of cause and effect right back to the very beginning. And how do you get something out of nothing? And so the question is, well, what about God then? If everything it can't just appear, has to be made, where did God come from? That is a really, really great question. Let me just offer a couple of brief thoughts about it. One of the things when we're talking about the idea of God is that we are talking about somebody who is not material, who is not part of the physical universe, and therefore the laws and principles, like the laws of cause and effect that we see at work within the physical universe, those same laws can't be applied to God, because God is not a thing who exists within the universe of things. Another way would be to think about it would be this, was that the idea of cause and effect requires time, because it says that after was caused by something that happened before. And yet before the universe began, there was no time. So you can't talk about the idea of God being created because there was nothing before God. The idea is that God just is. And it's not that God exists within time, it's that time exists within God. God is the from whom everything else comes. It's a little bit mind-blowing, but let's stick with it. If we are drawn towards good, why does some people seem to be the opposite? Last week we had a little think about where our idea of good and evil comes from. And we didn't particularly have a long time to develop that, but it was more thinking about the idea that the idea of good and evil is present within every human culture, even if some of us are more drawn to doing wrong than we might like, and even if most of us aren't as good as we might want to be. So why is it that some people are drawn more towards evil, more towards doing wrong than doing right? Why is it that we aren't? Well, I think the answer to that is that good and evil coexist within all of us. It's Dostoevsky who says that the line between good and evil doesn't run through states or countries, but it runs through every human heart. Good and evil coexist within all of us. And when we recognize that, it's part of the pointer towards the one who is beyond us, who is truly good, who wants to help us face the reality that good and evil exist within all of us in different measures, and wants us to help us overcome those impulses, however strong or weak they might be within us, the impulse towards doing evil. Here's a very specific question from last week. We had a quote from Richard Dawkins at the end of the week about at the bottom there being nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Why did Richard Dawkins talk about blind, pitiless indifference? Has he had bad experiences in his life? I don't feel qualified to answer that question. You would have to ask him, or perhaps read a little bit more of his book. The thing that I think I would say is that we know that psychologically, the idea that a person is an accident, for a child to be brought up thinking they were an accident is not great for them mentally, emotionally, and psychologically. I know a man in his early 70s who his parents used to joke that he was an accident, not in a mean way, that was just the way it was. And even though he was a very successful, done really quite well for himself, all through his adult life, the idea that he wasn't really supposed to be here plagued him. But when he became a Christian, when he made that choice and began to discover that his life fitted into a bigger picture, he began to realize that with God there are no accidents. And it really addressed at a fundamental level a question that he had about himself. So my question would be to people who say, oh, we're just an accident, there's just no design, no chance, it's just pure chance. If we know psychologically that that is not good for any of us to believe that we are accidents, it's not good for children to think that they're accidents. Children are more likely to prosper if they know that they were longed for, hoped for. Why would we make that the basis of our worldview? How could that be the basis of a psychologically, mentally, and emotionally healthy worldview? That there is no chance. We're all just here. There is no design. There is no purpose. We're all just here for as an accident because of chance. Here's the final question. What is the last question we finished with last week was, who is Jesus? What is the historical evidence of Jesus' existence? Does the Bible count as evidence? What a great question. Thank you so much for asking it, because it takes us into this week's topic, which is all to do with that. Who is Jesus?
Who is Jesus?
I think,
I believe he was a person.
he's the Son of God.
I don't believe Jesus ever really existed.
Son of God.
If I have to answer that question, I would say God.
He plays on the wing for Chelsea.
If you read the Bible, I don't think I believe in all of that.
Everything. He can be any, but for me he's everything.
Who is Jesus? To be honest with you, I don't know. I'm not super religious or anything, so
I mean, I guess it's a savior or something.
Personally, I think that Jesus was probably a really cool dude who lived a long time ago and gave great advice to people, and it snowballed from there.
People have a variety of opinions about what is at the heart of Christian faith. Some people think it's about church going, it's about being more religious or being more spiritual. Some people it's about kind of believing vaguely in God, or for other people it's about, Christianity is about trying to be a good person, trying to be a better person. But actually, this question is what lies at the heart of Christianity. Who is Jesus? Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, I'm not sure I know why we're thinking about this question, because last week we were talking about God, and I still have lots of questions about the idea and the existence of God. So why are we jumping so quickly to start talking about Jesus? Well, for two reasons, really. The first is that as we started to think last week, the question of who Jesus is, the evidence offered by the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus, they form one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for the existence of God. If the story of Jesus is true, as we'll be looking at in a minute, then it only could be possibly true because there is a God. That's the first reason. And the second reason is this, is that if you want to know what God is like, then you look at the life of Jesus. If what we are going to be thinking about today is true, then it doesn't just tell us that there is a God, it tells us what God is like, because we see most perfectly who God is in the life of Jesus. But before we can get into the question of who Jesus is, we have to take a step back for a minute and ask the question, did Jesus exist?
Jesus of Nazareth is believed to have walked these streets around 2,000 years ago. But is there any evidence that he even existed?
Well, there's actually quite a lot of evidence. No serious historian would deny that Jesus existed. The Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius wrote about Jesus, as did the first century Jewish historian Josephus. He described him as Jesus, a doer of wonderful works, and then he goes on to describe his crucifixion and alleged resurrection.
So there's evidence outside of the New Testament for the existence of Jesus, but most of the evidence comes from within inside the New Testament. And sometimes people say, well, the New Testament was written such a long time ago. How do we know what was written down hasn't been changed over the years? Well, the answer is that we do know, because of a science called textual criticism.
Textual criticism examines the number of copies of early texts that we have available to us today, and it looks at the time gap between the original document and the earliest copy that we have. And basically, the more manuscripts we have and the earlier they are, the less doubt there's going to be about the original. So let's compare the Bible to other texts in ancient history, ones that are widely used in schools and universities. Let's look at the Greek historians Herodotus and Thucydides. They both wrote in the 5th century BC. But the earliest copy of their writings that we have dates from AD 900, and that makes a 1300-year time lapse. And even then, we only have 8 copies of these manuscripts in the first place. Or look at the Roman historian Tacitus. There's a 1,000-year gap between his book being written and our first manuscript, and we only have 20 copies. Or another classic, Caesar's Gallic War, 950 years between the book being written and our first manuscript copy. And even then, we only have 9 or 10 copies of these manuscripts. Again, with Livy's famous History of Rome, a 900-year gap between the book being written and our first manuscript, and we only have 20 copies of this. But when it comes to the New Testament, well, it's very different. The New Testament was written between about 40 and 100 AD, and we have manuscript evidence going back as early as 130 AD, and full manuscripts by 350 AD. And we have more than 5,300 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin translations, and 9,300 others. So, we can be pretty confident in the accuracy, the authenticity, and the integrity of the New Testament scriptures that have been passed down to us today. The remarkable thing about the Bible is there's such a short chronological distance between the events being described and our first manuscripts. So in many ways, the Bible scholars are in a very fortunate position of being able to check these things out and finding that they are much more reliable than, for example, some of the alternatives you're looking at. And as a scholar, I am more than happy to say I trust this, I take it very, very seriously, I rely on it.
Professor F.J.A. Hort, one of the greatest scholars in the area of textual criticism, concluded that, in the variety and fullness of the evidence on which it rests, the text of the New Testament stands absolutely and unapproachably alone amongst ancient prose writings, and no secular historian would disagree with that conclusion.
Show you a picture to illustrate Alistair McGrath's point. This is a photograph of the oldest fragment from the New Testament that there is in the world. It's a photograph I took because you can go and see this in the John Rylands Library in Manchester. Actually, you can't go and see it right now because it's closed like everywhere else. But when things begin to reopen, you will be able to go and see it. This is the oldest fragment of Bible in the world. It's a fragment from John's Gospel, from chapters 18 and 19, and it is dated, it has been dated, I'll put these photos in the video so you can see, it has been dated to 125 AD. Now, John's Gospel was one of the later books. It was probably the last Gospel to be written, so we're probably dated around 70, 80 AD, maybe a little bit later than that. There's always a debate around whether things are pre-70 AD or or after 70 AD. But regardless of that, we have a fragment from John's Gospel that you can go and see for yourself, that was written, created within living memory of when the book itself was written. And as you've just seen with Alistair McGrath, we have thousands and thousands of documents like that. What does that fragment say? Well, it's from John's Gospel. And if you were to read it, it says largely the same, slightly different phraseology, but it's from these verses. They're a little bit obscure, but it's from John 18:31 to 33. And it's of the chief priests talking about the crucifixion of Jesus. And they say, we've got no right to execute anyone, they objected. And then John's commentary is this: this took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. And that's what that says. And the reason I know that is because that fragment of Bible, along with every other document, have all been borne in mind when our modern Bibles are created. So the New Testament scriptures, as we have them, are reliable and are dependable. That they haven't been changed. We know they haven't been changed because paper trail that leads us to within touching distance of the original manuscripts themselves, carefully crafted, carefully copied over nearly 2,000 years to try to give us the best chance we can have of discovering Jesus for ourselves.
So we know from evidence outside and inside the New Testament that Jesus existed. But who was he? Well, we know that he was fully human. He had a human body. He ate, he drank, he sweated, he got tired, he suffered pain. And he had human emotions, love, joy, sadness, and human experiences. He had the experience of growing up in a family, of education, of having a job, of being tempted. And he experienced bereavement and suffering and torture and even death.
Many today will say, okay, he was a human being, but only a human being. Maybe he was a great religious teacher, but no more than that. Others would say he was much more than that.
Bono, the lead singer of the band U2, has said, I don't think you're led off easily by saying he was a great thinker or philosopher, because actually he went around saying he was the Messiah. That's why he was crucified. He was crucified because he said he was the Son of God. So he either, in my view, was the Son of God or he was nuts. And I find it hard to accept that all the millions and millions of lives, half the earth, for nearly 2,000 years, have felt their lives touched and inspired by some nutter. I don't believe it. He went on to say, I believe that Jesus was the Son of God.
So we know that Jesus was fully human, but was he more than that? How might we decide? How might we uncover that for ourselves? Well, there would be two things that we would need to look at. Firstly, we would need to look at what Jesus said and thought about himself. Because if he didn't think he was God, then there's no reason that we should think that. So what did he think about himself? And then secondly, we need to ask ourselves the question, was he right, what he said? So what did Jesus think about himself? How did Jesus talk about himself? What is immediately noticeable about Jesus is that he speaks about himself very differently from any other religious teacher or prophet. Most religious teachers, like me, our job is to point people away from ourselves towards God. My job is not to draw your attention to me. My job is to try to point your attention towards God. And yet Jesus didn't do that. Jesus Jesus consistently drew people's attention to himself by the way that he spoke about himself. He would say things like, he would say to those who were hungry and looking for purpose in life, he would say, I am the bread of life. He would not say God is the bread of life. He would say that I am. For a woman who was mourning the loss of a loved one, he said, I am the resurrection and the life. Not God is the resurrection and the life. He would say, I am. For people who were looking for direction and purpose in life, he would say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Not God is the way, the truth, and the life. And it was these kinds of things that got him into trouble. In fact, the reason that he was arrested in the end were not for all of the things that he did. It was for the claims that he made about himself. And the clearest one was when he said, I and the Father, in which he was talking about God, he said, I and the Father are one. It was this claim that got himself into most trouble. So that when those who opposed him gathered around him and said, you can't say these things, he said to them, well, what is it that you are trying to arrest me for? What is it that you're trying to stone me for? Is it for all the good works that I've done? They said, no, it's for blasphemy, for claiming that you and God are one. It is an incredible thing for a person to claim. And it leaves us it forces us to make a decision about what we think about who Jesus is. C.S. Lewis puts it like this. C.S. Lewis, the writer of the Narnia stories, he says this. The one thing we must not do is say that Jesus was a great moral teacher, a good man, but that he did not claim to be God. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher or a good man. He would either be a lunatic or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. But let us not come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. So was he right in what he said about himself? If he made these claims that he and the Father are one, was he right? Was he telling us the truth? How might we know? What evidence is there that Jesus was who he said he was?
So was Jesus right in what he said about himself? What evidence is there to support his claims? Well, the first piece of evidence is his teaching. Much of the New Testament records numerous occasions where crowds gather to hear Jesus teach.
And on one occasion, on a mountain like this, more than 5,000 people gathered to listen to the teaching of Jesus. The Sermon on the Mount has been widely acknowledged amongst the greatest teaching of all time. Jesus' teaching has been the foundation of our entire civilization. Many of our laws were originally founded on Jesus' teaching.
Love your neighbour as yourself. Do to others as you would have them do to you. And then this, totally revolutionary. Love your enemies.
In fact, we've advanced in every field of science and technology, yet in 2,000 years, no one has ever improved on the moral teachings of Jesus. They are the greatest words ever spoken. They're the kind of words you might expect God to speak. Another thing that marked Jesus' life was his love for the marginalised, feeding the hungry, healing the sick. His character has impressed millions who wouldn't call themselves Christians. Time magazine called him the most persistent symbol of purity, selflessness and love in the history of Western humanity. He was a person in whom even his enemies could find no fault, and whose friends said that he was without sin. It's been said that our character is truly tested when we're under pressure or in pain. And when Jesus was being tortured, he said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing."
Another piece of evidence is his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. No one else in history has had a whole collection of books written about them before they were born. Jesus fulfilled over 300 Old Testament prophecies, 29 of them in a single day. Of course, it could be suggested he was a kind of clever con man who set out deliberately to deceive people. He read all these prophecies and he thought, right, I'm going to go through and I'm going to fulfill them all in my life. The difficulty with that theory is that, first of all, the sheer number of them. And then the fact that, humanly speaking, he had no control over many of these things. There were prophecies about the exact manner of his death, about the place of his burial, even about the place of his birth. Clever con man would be going around and saying, oh my goodness, I'm supposed to be born in Bethlehem. It's too late. Then the final piece of evidence, his conquest of death. The physical resurrection of Jesus is the cornerstone of Christianity. And this is relevant to every single one of us because we're all going to die. It's the ultimate statistic. 1 in 1 die. You go to a funeral. The coffin is lowered into the ground. It looks absolutely final. And it is. Unless Jesus died and was buried and then was raised to life. In which case, death has been conquered. But is this just wishful thinking?
Rose from the dead. That's what I was taught. I don't know, I can't say yes or no.
Yes, I do believe that Jesus rose from the dead.
As a man of science, I think that
So we've looked at Jesus' teaching, the incredible way of living that he taught. We've looked at Jesus' own character, the kind of person that he was, the particular care that he had for the marginalized and the poor in society. We could also, one of the most compelling pieces of evidence is his fulfillment of prophecy. It's been estimated that Jesus, through Jesus' birth, life and death, he fulfilled over 300 prophecies from the Old Testament. Now, someone might say, oh, well, he could have engineered that. He could have arranged, he would have known the scriptures, so he would have known what he needed to do to fulfill those prophecies. Well, you could argue that. The problem with that is that the sheer volume, the sheer number of them is kind of over 300 is quite something. And the second thing is that Jesus actually had no control over many of those prophecies. Jesus had no control over where he was born. No one has any control over the circumstances surrounding their birth, and yet his birth fulfills a number of prophecies. Jesus had no control over his early life as a child, and yet that too fulfilled prophecies. Jesus had no control over the circumstances of his death, and yet his death and then what happened next, they too fulfill numerous biblical prophecies. So his life is the fulfillment of promise. And the final piece of evidence that just maybe he was who he said he was is, of course, his conquest over death. The remarkable events surrounding his death and what happened next. They form, for the first generation of Christians, they form the most compelling evidence, not only for the existence of God, but for the truth of the truth that Jesus was who he said he was. But to find out more about that, you're going to have to come back next week when we look at the second half of who is Jesus. We look at his death and his resurrection. We look at his death on the cross and what happened next. So much for joining in with our Alpha at Home session today. I hope you found it interesting and engaging. As last week, if you want to leave comments in the Facebook post, please feel free to do that. But if you'd like to send in a question, you can do that to our Alpha email address, alpha@croftonparish.org.uk. Thank you so much for going on this journey with us into the ideas and to the person at the heart of Christianity. I hope you'll join us again. It'll be someone else next week doing the input, but I'll certainly be responding to your comments and your questions. I hope you'll join us again next week when we continue with our looking at the answer to the question, who is Jesus?